He thought it would be easy. The stage was built for men like him. Sharp suits, sharp questions, and an audience desperate to be entertained. The studio lights cast a cold, surgical glow across the panel desk. Every camera was live. The world was watching. Elias Vandrel, star commentator, intellectual celebrity, professional disassembler of faith, leaned forward with the confidence of a man who had never once lost a televised debate. He thrived on interruptions, on condescension disguised as wit, and tonight he was handed a prize he had long waited for. Pope Leo XIV. The old man sat across from him in silence, hands folded, robe still. He looked like he had wandered into the wrong century. Ancient, out of step, a relic of incense and marble halls. That's how Elias saw him. That's how he wanted the audience to see him. So when the host gestured for the segment to begin, Elias didn't waste time. "Your Holiness," he said, the words already laced with smirk, "you speak often of the Holy Spirit. But don't you think invoking an invisible entity to justify the Church's authority sounds, well, a bit like superstition dressed in robes?" The crowd didn't laugh yet, but they were leaning in. He pressed harder. "I mean, seriously, in 2025, are we still supposed to believe in a ghost that whispers into people's hearts? Or is it just a poetic excuse for whatever you already wanted to say?" A low murmur moved through the room. Some smiled. Some looked down. Cameras caught it all. Elias sat back, pleased, and Pope Leo did nothing. At first, it looked like he hadn't heard, or hadn't understood, but then the silence kept going. 6 seconds, 10 seconds, 12, and in that silence, something shifted. Not in the Pope's posture. He hadn't moved an inch, but in the room itself, in the temperature, in the breathing, in the sudden awareness that they were no longer watching a game. Then the Pope raised his eyes. What followed was not a defense. It was not a rebuttal. It was a sentence so quiet and so steady. The microphones barely caught it, and yet every word landed like stone on glass. "You speak that way," the Pope said, "because you've never been alone long enough to hear anything but your own voice." The room stopped. A silence fell. Not awkward, not staged, but thick. One of the producers took off his headset. The host shifted in his chair. Elias, for the first time that night, said nothing. It wasn't a debate anymore. It was something else. And no one, not even Elias, knew what would come next. The silence didn't end. It deepened. For a few unbearable seconds, the studio became a sanctuary. Unwilling, unprepared, but unmistakably sacred. The control room fell quiet. No cues, no cuts. No one dared look directly at Pope Leo XIV, as if eye contact alone might unravel something in them they weren't ready to name. Elias Vandrel swallowed, but kept his smile, though thinner now. Something behind his eyes, so quick it almost didn't show, shifted. He'd come to puncture, to dominate. But something had slipped. Something had broken the rhythm. He didn't yet know what. But those watching did. The world was watching. Millions of screens across nations carried the moment live. Subtitles flickered in 16 languages as translators whispered feverishly through earpieces. The segment was titled Faith in the Modern World, and it was supposed to be nothing more than another sparring session. A bit of showmanship wrapped in questions, ending in applause and polite disagreement. No one had expected silence, and no one had expected this particular pope to make it sacred. For months, Leo XIV had withdrawn from public conflict. Rumors circled: illness, scandal, old age. Others said he had gone into retreat, that he was praying too much, that he was done. They had forgotten who he was. Born to a mechanic and a schoolteacher, he had not entered Rome through its gates, but through its gutters. First as a field medic, then as a missionary in forgotten corners of war. He had walked barefoot across minefields to reach children. He had lived with prisoners long after the guards fled. He had buried the dead without vestments, slept under rain, held hands with mothers who'd stopped praying because hope had become too painful. He had been called many things, but never loud, never political, only faithful. A cardinal once said of him, "He listens so deeply you start hearing your own soul speak back to you." And it was true. Leo XIV spoke rarely. But when he did, entire rooms, entire nations shifted. It had taken the College of Cardinals by surprise when the conclave chose him. But the world had felt the weight of that choice almost immediately. This was not a man who argued. He convicted. Elias Vandrel had never believed any of that. To him, Leo was the perfect opponent, ancient, predictable, dressed in robes of fading relevance. Elias had made a career out of mocking faith, not with rage, but with charm. His smirks were famous, his jabs well-rehearsed. He wasn't angry at religion. He just didn't need it. He once said in an interview, "If God exists, he could book a seat on my show. Until then, I'll take logic." He had become the intellectual mascot for the post-religious world. Eloquent, progressive, and devastatingly quick. But tonight, he wasn't winning. And that terrified him more than he'd admit. Because across from him sat a man who had just dismantled his opening salvo. Not with argument, not with data, but with stillness, with presence, and with a single line that cut deeper than anything Elias had prepared for. You speak that way because you've never been alone long enough to hear anything but your own voice. It hadn't just pierced Elias. It had pierced the room. And the moment, now, demanded more than cleverness. It demanded truth. This wasn't just another debate. It was something else. Something no one watching could name, but everyone could feel. The tension wasn't theatrical. It was moral. Because in an age where everything sacred had been turned into spectacle, Pope Leo XIV had just reminded the world what reverence looked like. This is why it mattered. He hadn't spoken publicly about the Holy Spirit in nearly a year. Whispers of exorcisms, of spiritual warfare, of old-world doctrines had swirled. But Leo had remained silent. Until now. And now, he wasn't just defending doctrine. He was confronting the world's most comfortable lie. That the Spirit is dead. That silence is empty. That conscience is just noise. He said none of that out loud. But somehow, in the stillness, it had all been said. And the millions watching felt it. Not all believed it. But none could deny the shift. If you believe the media too often drowns out true wisdom, subscribe to Holy Shadows now. But if you're still unsure, comment below. Why does truth spoken calmly still make people angry? Elias adjusted his collar. His hands moved deliberately, fingers smoothing an invisible crease. The smile returned to his face, but thinner now, less a performance than a shield. He leaned in, not with aggression, but calculation. He'd regained just enough composure to remember his audience. The show had to go on, and if the old man wanted silence, Elias would fill it with the kind of sound that felt intelligent but didn't require conviction. "Your Holiness," he said, tone feigning respect. "You speak of the Holy Spirit as though it's a person, a voice that whispers into people's hearts. Isn't that dangerous, especially when you hold influence over millions? Can't anyone claim divine inspiration if they just feel something strongly enough?" The question was crafted carefully, bland enough to sound reasonable, sharp enough to cut if answered clumsily. It was the kind of question that trapped bishops and made seminarians stutter. It poked at the central wound of modern faith. How does one speak of the unseen in a world addicted to proof? Pope Leo XIV remained still. There was no tightening of the jaw, no flicker of frustration. Only a gentle breath before his reply, slow, steady, as if every word had been carried from a deeper place than thought. "I don't believe in the Spirit," he said. The audience tensed. A trap? A contradiction? He continued, "I know it, and I know it not because I've studied it, but because I've seen too much to lie to myself." No reaction from Elias. But behind his eyes, the discomfort was building. Pope Leo's voice remained soft, but it filled the space like incense, quietly, relentlessly. "I've seen the Spirit in hospice rooms, where breath comes shallow and peace comes suddenly. I've heard it silence in war zones, where bullets fly and yet a child sings. I've felt it in prisons, not during confessions, but afterward, when hardened men weep without knowing why." He looked at Elias now, not as a challenger, but as someone lost. The Spirit isn't a force. It's a presence. It doesn't argue. It waits. Elias cleared his throat, visibly irritated by the lack of confrontation. His next question came quicker, try to regain control. "But isn't that just poetry? Beautiful words to dress up uncertainty? Let's be honest. Hasn't the church always used the idea of the Holy Spirit to escape reason? When logic fails, invoke the divine. The Pope did not look away. Perhaps, he said, it's not the Spirit you doubt, but what it might demand of you if it were real. The line landed with no dramatic music, no camera cut, just the air tightening around the words, as though something sacred had been named aloud and could not be taken back. Elias blinked. He didn't answer. Somewhere in the audience, a man crossed himself. A woman wiped her eyes. Most sat still, not understanding why they felt heavier. There was no applause. It would have felt wrong. The conversation had barely begun, and already something inside it had cracked open. If this conversation is stirring something you can't explain, subscribe to Holy Shadows. But if it isn't, go to the comments and tell us what you're afraid the Holy Spirit might reveal to you. Elias's smirk returned, sharper now, less a shield and more a weapon. So, he said, voice edged with impatience, is this talk of the Holy Spirit really just a veil? A clever cloak to hide the church's many failures. The scandals, the cover-ups, the abuses that were swept under the rug while holy men invoked spirits and miracles. The words cut through the studio like a cold wind. Cameras caught the flicker of discomfort on a young producer's face. The audience shifted, sensing the battle lines drawn not between faith and doubt, but between accusation and redemption. Pope Leo XIV did not flinch. His eyes, calm and unwavering, held the weight of decades. People are tired, Elias pressed on, tired of invisible scapegoats that absolve responsibility, tired of faith used to silence victims instead of seeking justice. A pause, and then the Pope's voice shifted, deeper now, steadier, as if summoning memories too heavy for words alone. I have seen what you refuse to see, he said softly. I have held mothers who cried because their sons heard voices in the dark, voices that tormented and threatened, voices no one else would believe. The room fell silent, and I have watched those mothers stop crying, he continued, when the voices ceased after prayer, when the Spirit brought peace where none was expected. Elias's mouth tightened. He opened it to retort, but the weight of that confession hung between them, heavier than any argument. The Pope leaned slightly forward, voice steady, resolute. Politics divides. The gospel unites. And the Holy Spirit, he said, does not choose sides. It convicts hearts, rich or poor, powerful or weak, without exception. There was no anger in his words, only an unshakable conviction that outmatched the room's growing tension. The pattern was clear, each calm statement met by skepticism, each skeptical jab met by grace, then personal witness. The atmosphere rippled like waves, one moment still, the next crashing, then pulling back to quiet. Elias's voice rose slightly, trying to regain control, but Pope Leo's presence was unyielding. The moral line had been drawn. Invisible to some, undeniable to others, the Spirit held the room captive. If you have ever felt something unseen holding your life together, subscribe to Holy Shadows now. And if you haven't, tell us in the comments how you have stayed whole without it. Elias's lips curled into a sardonic smile, the kind that suggested he believed he had already won the moment. His eyes gleamed with that cold certainty, the kind of arrogance born from countless victories and debates where faith was always the easy target. So, he began slowly, savoring the weight of his words, letting each syllable drip with contempt and calculated dismissal. You speak to a ghost and call it the Holy Spirit. Isn't that just manipulation in holy robes? A clever ruse, an ancient trick to control the masses with fear and superstition. The studio seemed to tighten, as if the very air grew heavier. The tension stretched like a bowstring pulled taut, ready to snap. Cameras zoomed in, hunting for a crack. Any sign of faltering faith from the old man whose calm presence so starkly contrasted Elias's biting bravado. But Pope Leo XIV remained unmoved. His hands rested quietly on the polished table, fingers intertwined, not clenched, not trembling. His eyes met Elias's with a steady gaze. deep, unshakable, carrying the weight of decades. Decades marked by unseen battles and silent witness to suffering that words could barely capture. He did not raise his voice. He did not scold. He did not dismiss. Instead, his reply came like a whispered prayer, soaked with the weight of 1,000 moments spent cradling grief and hope in the same breath. "I have held children in my arms," he said, voice low, yet resolute, steady as the rock beneath a storm-tossed sea. Children who begged God for one more breath, one more moment with the fragile thread of life they barely grasped. He paused. The room grew stiller still. "You call that superstition," he continued softly, "but I call it sacred." A hush settled over the studio like a thick fog, swallowing noise, leaving only the gravity of his words. One by one, the panelists' expressions shifted, some folding into reverence, others tightening with discomfort. The youthful woman across the table lowered her gaze, her eyes glistening with a quiet, unseen sorrow. Even Elias faltered, his confident smirk slipping for just a fraction of a second, revealing a crack in his armor. The silence was not empty. It was filled with something immense, something eternal. This was no longer a debate, no longer a contest of clever ideas. This was a confrontation with a sacred truth, one that refused to be mocked or diminished. "You call it naive to protect the innocent," Pope Leo pressed on, his voice steady, unwavering, a rock in a storm that refused to break. "I call it sacred." The words lingered in the air, suspended between conviction and revelation, echoing in the stillness, as if time itself held its breath to listen. For a long moment, the room was caught in that sacred pause, caught between the rush of doubt and the quiet power of faith made real by suffering and love. If you feel the weight of what was just said, do not scroll past this moment. Subscribe now to Holy Shadows. And if you won't, tell us in the comments why sacredness means nothing to you anymore. Pope Leo XIV's gaze did not waver. He leaned forward slightly, the years etched into his face, speaking louder than any words. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a final reckoning. "You confuse engagement with endorsement," he said quietly, yet with unyielding authority. "I do not speak to sinners because I approve of their sins. I speak because silence kills. Because when we turn away from the presence of God, we abandon the broken to despair." The words hung in the air, a mirror held up to the room. For the first time, Elias looked away, his confident facade faltering beneath the weight of truth. The host blinked rapidly, searching for a thread, anything to pull the conversation back. But none came. The studio was enveloped in silence. Not the polite pause of broadcast theater, but the stillness that follows a blow struck deep. Pope Leo's voice softened, drawing the moment into a larger truth. The Holy Spirit is not a weapon to be wielded. It is not a tool for manipulation or division. It is the breath that reminds us we are alive, more than flesh and bone, more than politics and power. Without it, we become nothing but machines, programmed to deny the very soul that cries for justice, mercy, and truth. Across the room, faces shifted, some with relief, others with discomfort. The confrontation had stripped away pretense. The debate was no longer about words or doctrines. It was about what it meant to be human. If you believe silence in the face of truth is betrayal, subscribe to Holy Shadows now. And if not, go to the comments and tell us. What truth would make you speak up? The room had shifted. The harsh glare of confrontation softened into something almost sacred. A quiet space carved out amid the storm of voices and questions. Pope Leo XIV, who had been steady and firm through every jab and accusation, now carried a gentler weight, a pastoral presence that invited reflection rather than debate. He turned slowly toward the cameras, his eyes sweeping beyond the studio lights, to the millions of faces watching from distant places, people burdened with doubt, hope, and the silent ache of faith tested by a world quick to dismiss what it cannot see. This moment, he began, voice measured, filled with the grace of one who has lived through storms and found peace beyond them, was never truly about Elias. It was never about the debate, the challenge, or even the doctrine. It was about you, about every person who has ever sensed the Spirit's whisper in the depths of their heart, only to be told they imagined it, that their faith was folly, that their longing was naive. He let the words hang, heavy with empathy, as if speaking directly to those who had been silenced, shamed, or isolated for holding onto a truth others called invisible or outdated. We live in a world hungry for certainty, but starved of understanding. We thirst for answers, but often reject the quiet truths that cannot be measured or sold. This world does not need more clever arguments or louder voices to drown out the silence. What it desperately needs is more hearts that listen, truly listen, not just to words, but to the spaces between words, where the Spirit moves. A pause, the air shifts. A slight pause gave room for those watching to feel the weight of that invitation. The Pope's voice softened further, becoming almost a benediction. Louder voices demand attention, but they rarely bring peace. It is in the deep silence, when the noise falls away, that the Spirit speaks, not in thunder or spectacle, but in the stillness, where our souls can finally hear. His eyes glimmered with a quiet fire, the kind born from a lifetime of service and sacrifice. To those who have felt that still, small voice, do not silence it with doubt or fear. Honor it. Cherish it. Let it guide you beyond the turmoil of the world. Long pause. No music, just breath. The studio remained hushed. Even the harshest skeptic could feel the gravity of his words. Settle like a bomb. If you have ever heard that voice, subscribe now to Holy Shadows. Stand with those who seek the quiet truth amid the chaos. He paused, a gentle challenge threading through the silence. But if you choose not to subscribe, we dare you to speak honestly in the comments. Tell us, why does that still, small voice no longer move you? What fear or doubt hold you back from listening? Music slowly fades down. Fade to black. The screen faded slowly to black, leaving the question lingering. A call not just to faith, but to courage. This moment was no longer about a televised debate. It was about awakening, about listening, about the fragile, fierce power of the Spirit, waiting patiently in the silence. If you had been in that room, amid the flickering lights, the cameras, the millions of eyes fixed upon the moment, what would you have said to Pope Leo XIV? Would you have challenged him with the sharpness of doubt, wielding skepticism like a shield? Or would you have found the courage to speak softly, to honor the presence of something unseen, but deeply felt? This question is not just for the commentators or the faithful. It is for everyone who has ever paused and wondered, is the Holy Spirit real? Or is it merely a story, a comforting myth we tell ourselves to quiet the noise of uncertainty and fear? The truth is not simple. It refuses to be contained by arguments or dismissed with clever phrases. It calls each of us to wrestle with it in the silence of our own hearts. So now, we invite you, not as spectators, but as participants, to step into the conversation. Let this comment section become your confessional or your arena, where honest doubts and profound revelations can meet without judgment. Speak openly about the Spirit's presence or absence in your life. Share your fears, your hopes, your moments of silence or clarity, because it is here, in this sacred exchange, that faith is forged and truth is tested. May we all seek truth with humble hearts, willing to listen more than we speak. May our voices rise, not in pride or condemnation, but in grace and understanding, echoing the quiet power of the Spirit itself. Carry these reflections with you. Beyond this moment, let the still, small voice find you again, in the depths of your day, and may you have the strength to truly listen, to hear, not just with your ears, but with your soul.